Here we are again, session number 13 in our series in the first 7 chapters of Acts. Still trying to figure if we're going to do all 7 or just the first 6. That's still up in the air, I guess, but I'll still call it our series in the first 7 chapters of Acts. We're looking today in chapter 3, the beginning of chapter 3, verses 1 through 10. A few more verses today. Maybe we'll make our way in a little bit further. Well, what do we call it? Well, we're going to see the first healing of the Christian era. We're going to see the first recorded event of the apostles becoming embroiled in a public event at the temple, an event involving a startling healing. The recipient of the healing, well, he's apparently a 40 or 40 plus year old man who was born crippled and unable to move himself or walk from place to place. He was born that way, so he's been that way all 40 plus years of his life. Such a person in that culture, of course, had one means of support beyond his family. He had to be in a place that made begging for money not only possible, but profitable. And he needed a group of friends who would take him to such a place every day that he was to beg. The best place to beg, of course, was at the entrance to the temple. Why? Well, because people could earn merits under the law for giving alms to the poor. So people were encouraged to give. And so if you were there where people were encouraged to give, the rate of giving would probably be a little bit higher than down in the marketplace. Our episode opens at such a place, such a time, with such a man. Let's see how Peter and John handled that situation. Acts 3, verse 1. Now Peter and John were going up to the temple at the 9th hour. That'd be 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the hour of prayer. We've spoken before about Jewish time. Again, the day began at 6 a.m. The 9th hour, 9 plus 6, would take you to 15, which would be 3 past 12. So it would be 3 p.m. There were 3 times of formal prayer in the temple each day. Early morning, I don't know exactly what that time is. Expect it could be found, but so far I haven't looked for it. Afternoon, 3 p.m. That's where we are with this man. And then again at sunset. So early morning, afternoon, 3 p.m., and sunset. Notice that Peter and John were still keeping some of Judaism's rites and ceremonies. That's why they were going to the temple, right? To pray, just as they had done before. And most Jews, maybe their whole life. And the church also, in general, it seems, went to the temple at these various times and kept some of the Jewish rites and rituals, although knowing that none of them related to salvation itself, the plan of salvation. That makes sense, since we were told by Jesus that the church's mission would begin in Jerusalem. So here we see Peter and John at the time of prayer in the afternoon at the temple in Jerusalem So, in a sense, the mission of the church has begun. I think that's probably the best way to see it. Let's look at it. Go back and look again at Acts 1:8, where Jesus said, "But you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be my witnesses, both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria, and even to the remotest part of the earth." You start in Jerusalem. That's exactly where we are. That's exactly what's happening. And as we'll see later, Jerusalem was seen as the center of the church's world for quite some time. 15, 20 years, not sure exactly. But for a long time, the church at Jerusalem was the center of Christianity. As Peter and John went up that day, another person also went up. Let's look at verses 2 and 3 in Acts 3. "And a certain man who had been lame from his mother's womb was being carried along, whom they used to set down every day at the gate of the temple, which is called Beautiful." So somewhere there's a gate, is called the Beautiful Gate. Every day, friends of this guy, or friends of his mother, we don't know for sure, but they carried him to this temple gate where people were going in. And why did he go there? Well, in order to beg alms of those who were entering the temple. And when he, the lame man, saw Peter and John about to go into the temple, he began asking to receive alms. So here, Peter and James, their first time out that's recorded anyhow, they're going to the temple, and here is the beggar who's going to ask for alms. Now, if they gave alms, they would look like they were doing the right thing. What's going to happen? Well, who would those be who were the most likely to be given alms to beggars? Those going into the temple. Why those guys? Again, because giving alms earned you positive merit under the law. It was a good work. So this guy was dropped off at one of those gates in the temple grounds most days. The gate was called Beautiful, but there's no certainty about which gate it was. The gate that's seemingly favored by the scholars is called the Nicor, Nicor gate, which opened into the court of the women. Remember, these courts are like the Gentile court is an outside court. Then you go into the women's court, would be the first Jewish court inside the walls. So the women's court would be a place of access for most Jews. So they suspect that was the one called Beautiful. They have reasons for it, which go into tradition. I'm not going to spend time on it. Peter takes up his response to the question of alms beginning in verse 4 and going through verse 6. Look at what Peter does. Peter, along with John, fixed his gaze upon the man and said, so what's he doing? He's focusing. He's not ignoring the guy. He's focusing on this beggar. And he says, look at us. So he wants the beggar to focus on them also, Peter and John. And he began to give them his attention. So this guy did pay attention. Says, okay, why did he turn and pay attention? Because he's expecting to receive something from the two of them. But Peter said, I do not possess silver and gold. I ain't got any Sky. But what I do have, I'll give you. Here's what I have. In the name of Jesus Christ the Nazarene, which was a title used with Christ quite often, Jesus the Nazarene. Peter, though, says Jesus the Messiah, the Nazarene. The Nazarene from Messiah, the Messiah from Nazarene, named Jesus. And what does Peter say in the name of that person? Walk. Wow. This guy's been down for 40 or more years. He didn't flip the man a coin and move on, which, he could easily have done and say, well, I did right under the law. He secured the man's focus to begin a conversation that was to serve Peter's movement toward a witnessing opportunity. Peter is setting up a great opportunity. Why? Because there are people around, and God can use a miracle to get the people's attention, just like he had done a bit earlier at Pentecost. Remember, he used the wind sound, the fiery tongues, and the speaking in foreign languages. He's used all of that to draw a crowd, and Peter preached. So if this draws a crowd, Peter's gonna preach. He's on mission, he's on target. But when God wants to draw a crowd, he will indeed draw a crowd, just like he did at Pentecost. So we want to see, how does this crowd come to being? They're around there. They're all going in for prayer. So they're all going for primarily a principle, one single reason. But let me ask you a question before we go on. Do you think Peter knew his approach to the man would bring a crowd? It would create a crowd and lead to a witnessing opportunity? Another chance to preach as it did at Pentecost? Do you think Peter understood that? I have a feeling he had the idea that it could. So let's see. God was going to use Peter's call on the name, which meant the power and authority of Jesus, to perform a miracle. Notice he doesn't say, I'm going to heal you. He's not in that faith healing mode. He's saying, I'm going to call the power and the authority of our Messiah, Jesus the Nazarene, to perform a miracle. He didn't say he was going to perform a miracle, but he said, in that name and that power, get up and walk. He didn't even say get up, he just said walk. Let's look at starting in verse 7, and let's read the last 4 verses of our session today. And Peter, seizing him by the right hand, he raised him up. This is a man who can't get up. Peter raises him up. He lifts him by one hand. Peter must have been some kind of dude himself. And immediately the man's feet and his ankles were strengthened. Do you think that man felt something going on? You can almost bet on it. And with a leap, he stood upright and he began to walk. And he entered the temple with him. He says, hey, you guys, I can walk, I can jump, I can leap. I ain't letting go of you guys. But you stop and think, how unusual would that be for somebody to be jumping and hopping and dancing, whatever, going into the temple? They would have said, what a rude character. But all the people wanted to see what was going on because they recognized him. If they went there daily to the afternoon prayer sessions, they would have known this guy. They would have seen him multiple times. Almost every time they went, they'd see him there sitting. And now all of a sudden, they saw him walking and praising God, and they were taking note of him as being the one they recognized who he was, the one who used to sit at the beautiful gate of the temple to beg alms. And they, the crowd, were filled with wonder and amazement. That sounds a whole lot like the crowd at Pentecost, doesn't it? They were filled with wonder and amazement at what had happened to him. If they weren't paying attention, they didn't hear Peter's claim. This is Jesus of Nazareth, his power, his authority as the Messiah, as the deliverer, as our major man to come. His power caused this guy to get up. So far, there's been no talk of the crowd, has there? But the exuberance, even the downright rude behavior for the temple grounds that this guy, he was probably hopping, skipping, jumping, walking around, all within sight of the healing. He did it right where the miracle occurred. So, what do we have? This man had just had a very traumatic experience. Not negative, mind you, but a very traumatic experience nonetheless. For over 40 years, he had been sitting there helpless, do anything but ask for, I don't know, what do we call material when you beg? Alms, I guess. We'll call it that for the time being. He's suddenly doing something that he would never have thought would be ever possible. Peter evidently just grabbed a hold of him, raised him up to his feet, a position he hadn't held at any point in his life, and the man felt things changing in his feet and legs. I have neighbors, great believers. They have a son who has been unable to move himself since birth. So would they be happy about something like this? Absolutely. Peter evidently, again, grabbed hold of him, grabbed him, lifted him up. The guy felt something going on his feet. He hops, leaps, jumps, and says, "Whoa, wait a minute." But now note the crowd's reaction. Just as the crowd on Pentecost, what was it? Absolute amazement, even confusion, likely. Bewilderment, whatever terms you want to use. Let's go back to chapter 2 and see the comparison. In 2:7, it says, and they, the crowd, were amazed and astonished. And in verse 12 of chapter 2, it says, and they were amazed and perplexed. So amazed, astonished, amazed, perplexed. And they're saying to the other, what does this mean? And you can bet that is the question on the mind of the crowd right now. So they were in a state of needing an explanation, just like the people at Pentecost needed an explanation, and Peter will be more than gladly to offer it. But in the meantime, check out Isaiah and what he described as an end times feature. Remember, the church sees itself as the faithful remnant. And the church sees this age as the beginning of the last days that will lead to the end times. And this is actually a foretelling or a hint of what's going to happen. Because look what Isaiah said in chapter 35, verse 6. Isaiah says, "Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the dumb will shout." There will be miracles like you haven't seen. Well, they have just seen one. The people had just seen a foretaste of that prophecy of Isaiah's, a token, if you please, of the far fulfillment in the end times. This is a sort of quick, near fulfillment in this man, and it's going to take place in the here and the now, but the full event will take place in the last days after Messiah returns. So, this is the first, by the way, of 3 recorded healings given in the book of Acts, each being the recorded healing of a cripple. We got those here? Yeah, let me look at these. There are 2, one in chapter 9 and one in chapter 14. So we'll look into a part of Acts we ain't going to go to in this series, but I'll go there momentarily so you can see that this was not the only time there was ever such a healing in the book of Acts. Acts 9, verses 32, 33, and 34. Now it came about that as Peter, here he is again, was traveling throughout all those parts, he came down also to the saints who lived at Lydda. So he's not in Israel anymore. And there he found a certain man named Aeneas, who had been bedridden 8 years, not 40, but 8 years, for he was paralyzed. This man was no statement that he was completely paralyzed, just says he was incapable of getting up and walking. But here, and this is now in verse 34, Peter said to the man, "Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Arise and make up your bed." And immediately Aeneas arose. So there again, this is a foretaste of what's coming later in greater numbers, and the healing, as with the man we just were speaking about earlier, was an immediate and complete healing. And then in Acts 14, verses 8, 9, and 10, we see, "And at Lystra there was a certain man," now this is not going to be Peter, you can almost bet. "There was sitting a certain man without strength in his feet." In other words, he couldn't get up and walk. "Lame from his mother's womb, who had never walked." Very similar to the 40-year-old guy we spoke about a bit ago. This man was listening to Paul as Paul spoke, who, when he had fixed his gaze, and this is when Paul had fixed his gaze on the man, and seen that he had faith to be made well. There's another element creeping in now. Faith is the key. "And said with a loud voice," this is Paul, "Stand upright on your feet." And he leaped up and began to walk. Another foretaste of the end times, another immediate and complete healing. This time, the voice is the voice of Paul and not Peter, but of course, Paul had authority from Christ just as Peter. So purpose or the main source for the healing was the power and the authority of Jesus. There's a clue in that last example. What did Paul observe? What we just spoke about? That the man had the faith to be healed. Now, by the way, when you go back and look at the other ones, you're going to find the same thing happened. Those who were healed immediately and completely had faith that it would happen. Keep that, or could happen, not that it would, but that it could. Keep in mind, as next time we go to Peter's second sermon there in the temple. And while you're at it, think about this. John seemingly had no active part in this event except his presence. Yeah, he was walking with Peter. Yeah, he fixed his gaze on the man like Peter did. The man saw John. Why do you think Luke even bothered to mention John as being present? Think about it. It's not that hard to come up with. As a matter of fact, what did the Jews require to know that something was correct and true? 2 or more witnesses.